Namo Buddhaya, Namaste. Ending suffering. More specifically, experiencing the end of suffering. Now this we've all already done. If you've ever had a headache, a pain, anything of this nature, even if it's for some time, when it's gone, finished, over, you're experiencing the end of that suffering. Now, it's not to say that that suffering isn't replaced by another form of suffering, but that part of your suffering is gone. It may then be replaced by projections into the future about memories of the past, memories of this headache you've just had, and projecting it into the future. I don't want to have that headache again. What if I have that headache again? How will I suffer further? This is how we prolong suffering, with this kind of thinking, analytics, rather than understanding the very nature of I had a pain, now I do not have that pain. There is the end of suffering. So we have experienced, albeit in small amounts, the end of suffering. But it's these small amounts and these different parts and different kinds of suffering that build our overall impression, perception of suffering. Where is suffering? Suffering is coming to us through our 6 sense doors. Sense doors or windows, it doesn't matter. Of seeing, hearing, smelling, tasting, touching, and the 6th, thinking. So much suffering comes from the 6th, thinking, about everything that's coming in through those other 5 sense doors. Everything we're experiencing in this lifetime is as a result of seeing, hearing, smelling, tasting, touching, and then thinking about it, associating what we are seeing, hearing, smelling, tasting, touching with either memories of the past or taking those associations and projecting them into the future. Therefore, fueling and recycling and continuing suffering over and over again. This is like rebirth within this life. We take a moment of suffering and we're reborn into new suffering by our very own volition. And we can end this because we already have. After some time, if this headache never returns, it no longer becomes a problem. So, the way out of suffering is very clear in the Buddha's teachings. To practice the path towards Nibbana is very clear. It is Sila, Samadhi, Panya. Sila, the 5 precepts, Samadhi, meditation, and Panya, mental development, to develop our mind, wisdom. Now, I've talked about that on many occasions, and now I wish to focus on this ending of suffering, but also our perception of external suffering and how that really affects us. Because many of us consider other people before ourselves. We have compassion. The 4 Brahma Viharas of metta, loving kindness, karuna, compassion, mudita, joy for other people's success, and equanimity are there, just sometimes a little bit hidden. But generally speaking, we do have so much compassion for the rest of the world, all beings. And in a world currently where there is war, there is economic global problems, people starving, we can think this is extra suffering, and we can take it upon ourselves as a burden in itself. Sometimes there are principles that we hold dearly, tightly, that either socially or politically people are going against, and this can disturb our equanimity and make us feel vulnerable. But this is still all coming from external sources to be perceived internally as suffering. So firstly, when we've established where suffering is, and when we fully understand suffering is external, whether it is our own suffering or other people's suffering, we have to remind ourselves that we cannot solve the world's problems. We can, of course, do our best to help. We can have compassion. We can have metta, loving kindness, compassion, mudita. We must first try to help ourselves. In the aeroplane, they say when the oxygen mask falls, to put it on yourself before you try to help others. And the Buddha also taught us there is suffering, an end of suffering, but there will always be suffering in birth, aging, sickness and death. This is the nature of our lives, our existence. You cannot prevent this, but you can change your point of view, you can change your perception of this. Even later on, when Jesus came along 500 years later, he said there will always be the poor, there will always be the hungry, there will always be the sick. You cannot help everyone. It is a continued message through history that there is this always unsettled situation throughout the world, caused by what? Caused by greed, hatred, delusion. The three root defilements. So, getting back to sila, samadhi, panya, moral virtue, meditation and wisdom, one has to hold on to some principle. But if you forget all other principles and hold on to this one principle of sila in a protective way, holding it gently but close to your heart. When I say heart, interpret it widely. I'm not talking about the physical organ. Keeping this sila close to you as your guardian angel or deva, as your protector, will free you from suffering. You're already experiencing these momentary conditions of suffering and end of suffering, suffering and end of suffering. Headache, no headache. Pain in the knee, no pain in the knee. To take it to an even more minute level, when you breathe in, you had the desire to breathe in, albeit subconsciously. Having done so, you are immediately suffering, unless you breathe out. You're suffering again, unless you breathe in. Rebirth in every breath, rebirth in every thought. Rebirth doesn't have to be something to be believed in after physical death. It is happening in every moment. Your phone makes a notification sound. You're reborn into whatever you're expecting that notification to be. Yes, I got that job, I passed that exam. You've already planned your future. You look at it, it was a junk text, a junk mail or something like this. Oh, back to the drawing board. Reborn and died, all in a matter of seconds, over and over again. And this is where we are internally generating our own suffering, continually, over and over again. Taking all of the world's problems onto our shoulders, against the advice of teachers like the Buddha, Jesus. We don't have to ignore the world's problems, we don't have to ignore helping others, but the very best way to show others out of the way of suffering is to do so ourselves, by example. Now, I've just said you can experience the end of suffering in these small changes of suffering arising, suffering passing away. And we can really investigate this through our practice of meditation. But where does suffering come from? We know it comes from desire. We've learned this already. The desire to have something we haven't got, or not to have something we have got, like a headache. But this isn't the end of it. We are continually self-generating more suffering. It's like some suffering fuels more, contagiously. Because it's the running away from suffering to something else to cause more suffering that adds fuel to the fire. So when we just sit and develop equanimity, along with our existing compassion and loving kindness, sympathetic joy, we are balancing ourselves towards freedom from suffering. But this isn't done by altruistic means. We always should consider giving, but what is giving? Let's look at these precepts of no killing, no stealing, no sexual misconduct, no lying, and no taking of intoxicants. This is the greatest dana, the greatest gift you can give. And we all know if we give, we feel good. When I feed those cows, I feel good. The little cats and the dogs, and it's something I can do. I hope if I share some Dharma with somebody, that it helps them, then that action of right speech but good intention goes some way towards me feeling better, good, relieving suffering. Not in a way to change the world, not in a way to change people's views, in a way to share an experience. And we can all do this. We can give the gift of fearlessness to each and every being we ever come across by just keeping those 5 precepts. Now, have you ever noticed, if you look, and I suggest every time before we sit to meditate, review, reflect on the precepts over the last 24 hours since you last sat to meditate. Have I won't say broken, have I been flexible with any of the precepts in the last 24 hours? Yes or no? If you have, what did it bring you? Did it bring you freedom from suffering? Or did it bring you more suffering? I would hazard a guess that whenever you break one of the 5 precepts, it brings you suffering. Maybe temporary relief to some immediate suffering, but it is extending that suffering and continuing it into the cycle of rebirth in suffering. And this in itself, this understanding that, oh, I told this little fib, a white lie, but now it's bothering me, I'm having to remember not to forget that, to keep that up. This is suffering. Not a big moral issue, but it's suffering. If you didn't, someone may have been slightly offended for a moment or two. Or you could have not told a white lie and been mindfully careful about how you spoke, or said nothing at all. In order to protect yourself with your guardian angels of the precepts, we do have Buddhist names for these, Hiri and Ottappa, who are mythological figures of fear of breaking the precepts and sort of shame of having broken the precepts. Hiri, fear of, and Ottappa, of having broken the precepts. So we do have these emblematical reminders. Sometimes outside of Buddhist temples they have them either side of the door, which is a very appropriate reminder in an appropriate place. Hiri and Ottappa. This is how we are embarking on our journey towards the end of suffering overall in our lifetimes. But if we are experiencing the end of suffering in these moments, each and every day, throughout the day, we are building a foundation which is free from suffering for the rest of our lives to establish on. If we do what we ordinarily do, which is dwell on the suffering, rather than the smaller, unnoticeable gaps between, then we just continue the cycle of suffering. So we need to just slightly adjust our practice, or adjust our thinking, the sixth sense window, the thinking. It can be a little bit hazy, it needs a polish, so that we see clearly. Pali word vipassana means seeing clearly, and this is what we develop in meditation. We see clearly these moments where we're free from suffering. I took a deep breath. At the end of that breath, a change. Throughout our day this is happening. A rebirth, a new beginning. Are you dwelling on the previous breath? No. You're getting on with the next one. In our meditation, we bring our conscious awareness to such things. We can notice the feeling in our hands, because mindfulness is best practiced by bringing our conscious awareness into the body. If you notice the feeling in your hands of heat, maybe dampness, if you're going into a meeting, going to shake the boss's hand, you might rub your hands on your trousers if you have such things before you shake hands, not to give away your anxiety through your sweaty palm. But try bringing your attention, your conscious awareness, to the back of your hands. Here. Is it sweating there? Is your anxiety there? No. The tops of your feet, the backs of your ears. These are parts of your body where there's really nothing going on, but they're very much a part of you and they're there. But they're not bothering you. So what are you doing? You're ignoring them. Forgive me if you have got a pain in the back of your ear, but if you haven't, focus on that as being a pain-free area. Here, tops of your feet, behind your knees. But we focus on the headache, we focus on the pain, we focus on the wars in Russia and Ukraine. We focus on the economic disaster of the world. We focus on what's put in front of us on the news, on our media feeds, on whatever thing you have today to keep beeping you all day to tell you of the bad news. How often does it beep and tell you what a peaceful existence this person is having in this country doing absolutely nothing? There's no notifications about the lack of war in this country. There's no notifications about the lack of illness in this particular area. You know, this is not something that makes the news. And similarly, in our own minds, it's not something that's making the news. So once again, on a short, I think I said, this video will be about ending suffering. But I also said it's about experiencing the ending of suffering. Because we cannot end suffering. Suffering is there. We get old, we get sick, we die. But we can experience the end of suffering in every breath, literally, and during our day, in every moment, with mindfulness, with samadhi. The development of samadhi in our sitting meditation, and thereafter vipassana or sati, mindfulness. And think of mindfulness as just being careful in what we're doing, with attention, alertness, awareness to each and every aspect of what we're seeing, hearing, smelling, tasting and touching, how we're thinking and how we're reacting. This is mindfulness. And there are many exercises we can do to increase this mindfulness. Simple exercises like bringing your awareness, your attention back to the breath, even when you're walking, sitting, standing, lying down, working, driving, socializing, it doesn't matter. You will develop more mindfulness, to be more aware of those moments when suffering ends. Because I'm not showing you, asking you to understand how to end suffering, or even how to experience the end of suffering. Because we are all already doing that, experiencing the end of suffering in every moment. Now it seems to me I've said in this video, suffering so many times. I think every other word is suffering. And one could substitute it with different words. But it covers all manner of things, doesn't it? And we all choose our own form of this word. It could be pain, it could be hunger, it could be fear, it could be anxiety, depression. It could be all of those things for others. It could be all of those things for the global nation of human beings, animals, other beings, the life of the planet, global warming. It could even be developed into anxiety about where we came from and where we go to. Is there a God? Is there not a God? This sixth window of thinking is capable of creating so much suffering out of something so very little, just seeing, hearing, smelling, tasting and touching. When we know seeing as seeing, light or absence of. When we know hearing as hearing, sound or absence of. When we know smelling as smelling, smell or absence of. Tasting as tasting, taste or absence of. And touching, warm or cold, liking or not liking. All of these, liking, wanting, or not liking, not wanting. We can see they all come back to the desire of wanting something we don't have, wanting not to have something we have, desire. And this is the basis of greed. And when we don't get what we want, the basis of hatred. And this misunderstanding that we can replace our suffering by giving ourselves more suffering is delusion. Greed, hatred, delusion, the three root defilements. The cause of all this external suffering we see. Can you stop the war? No. Can you stop starvation? No. Can you even stop your own headache? Not really. But you can understand these things as being the result of greed, hatred, delusion, or our defilements. And more readily understandable, our desire. It doesn't mean you have to get rid of desire, but you can train desire to be wholesome with the Noble Eightfold Path of Sila, Samadhi, Panya. If you are keeping the 5 precepts, there's only 5, and even the 5th one, very important, and the 4th one, very important, 3rd, 2nd, 1st, very important. Hold them dearly to your heart, because there is no flexibility in them. Maybe one glass of wine, no. One glass of wine can lead to another, but even if it doesn't, how do we experience the end of suffering? How do we experience the end of suffering totally in this lifetime? Through the development of sati mindfulness. Intoxication, intoxicants, means the poisoning of mindfulness, poisoning of awareness. There are already 5 strong hindrances against the development of samadhi and ultimately mindfulness. By putting in a poison, you are completely destroying the ability to see clearly. This is why we take intoxicants, as a distraction or a masking, a way of not seeing clearly what is going on in front of us. Oh, I've had a terrible day, it was all awful, let me have a drink. Or, I can't deal with that until I've had a drink. I use drink, but I mean it could be anything. It's just an example. Does it help? You can be honest with yourself and answer that question. Maybe temporarily in the immediate time. Long term, again, an additional contribution to the recycling of suffering. Recycled suffering in rebirth, in every moment. So this is the nature of suffering. It's here to stay, but we can, as I've just spoken about, experience the ending of suffering in every moment. And ultimately, these moments will become more prevalent. Like when you're slowing down thinking by not doing anything in meditation to develop samadhi, the gaps between thoughts become wider, bigger, bigger as you practice. Similarly, the freedom from suffering between sufferings becomes broader, wider, bigger and bigger as you practice also, because you're not contributing to this recycling effect by simply keeping sila and practicing meditation. And this is the development of wisdom. I'm looking at the time to see that I haven't spoken for too long, but in my enthusiasm I didn't look at the time before I started. So why am I even doing that? Finally, you you might say, well, it's all right for you to say, sitting there, you're not amidst it all. Firstly, we must always look at our own selves, us. Look at yourself, and not to others' experiences. Unless, of course, we understand what's going on in the outside world, but in terms of this development, we look at our own practice first. And if you have a lot of suffering, you have a very difficult workplace, you have a very difficult relationship, you have some health problems, and you have maybe everything going on. You can say, well, I can see no gaps. There is no gaps. So use some of your time, make some time for meditation, which I know may be unsettling, the meditation itself, because of all these thoughts going on. But once you develop this habit of spending 40 minutes to an hour every morning when you wake up, 40 minutes to an hour every evening before you go to sleep, every day your thoughts will settle, will slow down. You will find gaps between the thoughts, and you will find gaps between these sufferings. And remind yourself it's all coming into you through these 5 sense doors and being processed by this mind. So we take this conscious awareness out of the situation by directing it to our meditation object in meditation. And when we develop samadhi, we are putting some distance between ourselves and what is happening. We're not shutting all of the windows. We're not closing our sense windows. You cannot do that. You can't run away from your suffering, because the majority of it comes from the 6th sense door of thinking. It's always going to be with you. You will always find something else to be suffering about. But you can put some distance between you and the suffering. When you meditate, you develop samadhi, and you understand the nature of the citta, of knowing. Knowing that when you're happy, you know you're happy. When you're sad, you know you're sad. But what knows you're happy? It is not happy. What knows you're sad? It is not sad. It is the knower of these emotional conditions resulting from this external stimulus of seeing, hearing, smelling, tasting, touching, or thinking. The knower is not the thinker. It can observe the thinker. It is the observationalist, the witness. And spending some time in meditation, you will know the knower. And this gives you distance. If you're in the traffic jam, in the car, horns going, everything all around you, people shouting, it's noisy, hectic, very busy, horrible environment. But when you're flying over that city in the aeroplane, that's just lots of pretty lights. Very beautiful to see. And silence between. Put yourself in the aeroplane above the traffic jam. There is the space between, where there is no suffering. And this can only be found by seeing clearly each and every moment. I think that's enough for today. I'm now going to be going for my meal, so there was some reason to look for the time. So I hope that helps. Please send any comments, emails, if you like, to englishbuddhistmonk@gmail.com. And if you have any thoughts about what I've said, or any questions, please feel free to comment. If you're new and you haven't subscribed, please subscribe. And I hope it was useful. If not, just forget about it. Certainly don't dwell on something that isn't useful. So, Sukhi Hotu, be happy, and Namo Buddhaya. Namo Buddhaya.